As we begin our study of Hebrew, the first thing that we need to address is the Hebrew alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet that you are going to be using today and that you see in modern printed editions of the Hebrew Bible is not the script that was originally used by the Jewish people. And it helps giving you a little bit of background to their writing system so that you can understand how the connection fits between the names of the letters, their sounds, and the shapes that you will be seeing. Originally, the Jewish people utilized the Phoenician alphabet, what we often refer to as Paleo-Hebrew or Old Hebrew. The Paleo-Hebrew alphabet can be seen in this copy of an inscription from the city of Jerusalem found in the Siloam Tunnel. The Siloam Tunnel was constructed by King Hezekiah in anticipation of a siege by the Assyrian army so that they could move waters from the pool outside the city walls inside of the city so that they would be protected during the time of the siege. As a record of that project, this inscription was made that describes the process as the workers worked from each end of the tunnel, hewing through solid rock to meet in the middle to bring the waters into the city. As you can see from this inscription, it doesn't look anything like the kind of Hebrew that you may have seen on the news or in some kind of Hebrew sign, or if you've seen any kind of printed Hebrew text. These characters are the root behind the Hebrew alphabet. Each letter is a pictograph. And by pictograph, what we mean is that it represents the shape of an object that gives the letter its name, but the pronunciation of that letter is not the name itself, it is only the first sound of that name. So, for example, to take 6 of these letters from the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, the letter Aleph is a name that refers to cattle, a cow. If you look at the shape of the letter, you'll see that this pictograph is a rough outline of the head of a cow. The name of the letter, Aleph, reflects its shape. The sound of the letter is only going to be the first sound in the word. In this particular case, the letter is a non-pronounceable consonant. It's silent, followed by Aleph. When you understand the shape of the letter, you know the name. When you pronounce it, you only use the first sound. Same is true of the letter Gimel. The letter Gimel, as you can see, is a rough approximation of the head and neck of a camel. When we see this letter, we don't say Gimel, we just say the letter G. The same thing is true of the letter Kaf. Kaf means hand, and the Paleo-Hebrew symbol for the letter Kaf was the rough outline of the palm of a hand. When we say the letter, we only pronounce the K sound, like the letter K. 3 other letters also illustrate this same phenomenon. So, for example, the letter Ayin is an I. It's thus represented by a circle, but when it was pronounced, they didn't pronounce ayin, they only pronounced the sound at the beginning of ayin. Pei looks like a mouth, which is the meaning of that particular word. When you pronounce that word, you don't say the letter pei, you do the P sound that we hear at the beginning of the word. And the same is true of the letter shin, or teeth. We don't pronounce the whole word, shin. We only pronounce the SH sound at the beginning of that word. So these Paleo-Hebrew letters help give you an idea of how the alphabet works in terms of its name and its pronunciation. Not long after that inscription was made, King Hezekiah was confronted with the emissaries of the Assyrian army. And in the biblical text, these foreigners converse with King Hezekiah in a trade language called Aramaic. And within the space of another 150 years, the Jewish people were eventually carried off into exile. And in exile, they used Aramaic daily and picked up the Aramaic alphabet. And it began to replace the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet as the way in which they recorded their ancient texts. As you can see from this copy from Cave 11 of the Dead Sea Scrolls, 11Q Leviticus B, the Aramaic script has now replaced the Paleo-Hebrew script in the recording of these ancient texts, with the exception of one word. God's personal name, the Tetragrammaton, is still recorded in Paleo-Hebrew out of respect in this particular document. That's not always true, but in this particular document they did. It is this script that is the source for what we see today. And that's easily seen when you put a word like Elohim, God, up against the Dead Sea Scroll script and the typeface that you now see in printed editions of the Hebrew Bible and in this grammar. This is the alphabet that you're going to be working with. Following that pattern then, as you learn the alphabet, you'll understand the significance between the names of the letters, the shapes of the letters, and what you will actually pronounce when you say these letters. The names come from Paleo-Hebrew. The shapes of the letters no longer look like these objects. Aleph no longer looks like a cow. Beit no longer looks like a dwelling. Gimel no longer looks like a camel. But these names still designate the historic alphabet of the Jewish people. They now have the shapes that they acquired from the Aramaic square script. And these are the forms that you're going to be memorizing in sequence. So as we look at the first row of letters, notice the names of the alphabets, their shapes, and also notice that when you pronounce these names, the accent's always going to be on the first syllable. Aleph, Gimel. Okay? So let me run through the first row, and then let's talk about those before we move on. So we have Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, and Zayin. Now, as you look at those, based on the description that we've given, you can already pronounce most of these letters. You have the name, but when you pronounce them, if you were to see them in the text, you would only be pronouncing the first letter, the first sound of each name. So as we said before, Aleph is a letter that we no longer hear. So you're going to say, it's simply going to be a transition between one vowel and the next vowel as you stop the syllable to move on. Beit is going to be a B sound. Gimel is going to be a G, etc., all the way across the board. One letter that you need to pay attention to is Vav. The letter Vav is written here with a V to remind you of the sound. In the future, however, we are going to also see it written with a W, and we tended to drift in that direction because historically the Vav was a W sound. This becomes important in later lessons, and so I call attention to it here. We'll return to that, but for now just think of it in terms of a V sound. Now look at those letters and notice that there's a similarity between some of these letters. So for example, the Dalet looks quite similar to the He if it weren't for the fact that the He is closed off on the left-hand side. These differences between the letters are going to be very important for you to pay attention to, as is something like the difference between the Vav and the Zayin, where it is simply the head of the letter that is going to make the difference between these two very distinct sounds. Let's add another row of letters. Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, and Mem. Once again, The sound of these letters is reflected by the first sound in the name of the letter that it has from its Paleo-Hebrew origins. As you look at these letters, one of the things you'll immediately see is we now have more letters that look alike. So the chet and the he look alike. If the chet is distinguished by the fact that it's closed off completely on the left-hand side. You also have to differentiate these two sounds. Their similar appearance is also reflective of the fact that they both are H letters. One is a soft H, he, as in happy. Chet is a hard H. It is going to be produced more with the vibration of your uvula in the back of your mouth. The kaf and the mem, you'll notice, have two forms that are in boxes. What this means is that these letters are the letters that are used when they appear at the end of a word. So, if the letter kaf appears at the beginning of a word, it will take the normal form. If it appears in the middle of a word, it will take the normal form. But if it appears at the end of the word, it will take the final form. Now, if you notice how these letters are shaped in, say, the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll notice that basically the only thing that has happened with these final forms is that they have been elongated. The kaf has its base dropped down below the line. The mem is longer and extends below the line. That's not seen in the forms that we now see in printed texts, because out of convention they get shaped a little bit differently. You'll notice that the kaf is now curved in its normal form, but square in its final form. And the mem has a different shape in its regular form and is almost a box in its final form. These differentiations in modern printing somewhat obscure the relationship that these final forms originally had, but originally they were just simply dropping the letter down below the line to make it a bigger letter so that you could very clearly see the distinction of when a word ended as you transitioned into the next word in the sentence. So pay attention to these final forms. They will be important for you to note. As you do that, notice also that the final kaf and the dalet are very, very similar in appearance. What makes the difference is going to be its length. If it's at the front of the word or in the middle of the word, you know it's a dalet, because kaf is a final form. But if you're at the end of a word where dalet or kaf could appear, it's going to be the length, the baseline of the letters, that's going to tell you whether or not you're dealing with a dalet or a final kaf. The next group of letters are the letters nun through tzadeh. Nun, samek, ayin, pei, and tzadeh. Of these letters, the ones that you'll have to pay attention with in terms of pronunciation are the ayin, which, like aleph, is a letter that you no longer hear. Originally, it was produced more in the back of the throat and did have a slight difference in sound than aleph. It's not a differentiation that you're going to be able to replicate and is often omitted totally. So as you say the letter ayin, you'll notice that it starts with a vowel. That is because the consonant that in this case is only reflected of the little apostrophe. It's like the aleph, which has an apostrophe that goes to the left, the ayin an apostrophe to the right, to differentiate the fact that these are silent letters but different. The ayin is only going to be pronounced as a transition in sound. It's going to be a silent stop in your pronunciation of the word. Tzadi is also a letter that you'll need to pay attention to because it's actually two sounds together. The closest equivalent that we have in English would be the letter X, X, where we have a K and an S together. It's the same thing with tzadi, only here it is a T and an S sound. Tzadi. As you look at this third row of letters, notice that the ayin and the tzadi are very similar in appearance. It's the angle of the strokes that makes the difference, and you're going to have to pay attention to those differences in order to distinguish between these letters when you're looking at a particular Hebrew word. The last row are comprised of the letters Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, and Tav. Again, the pronunciation of these letters is going to be just like it was before. You're going to be saying the first sound of the name of the letter. The Resh is going to be pronounced either with a trilled sound, R, somewhat like in Spanish, or R in the back of the throat, like you hear in French. The Sin and the Shin are distinguished only by a dot. That dot isn't in ancient texts. It was added in later in order to differentiate these sounds. So you'll see it in your printed text. Always remember that if the dot is on the left, it will be the letter Sin, an S sound, S. If the dot is on the right, it will be an SH sound, as in the letter Shin. The following page in your notes illustrates the important distinction in shape between many of these letters. As you can see from each grouping, there are a lot of similarities in the way that they are produced. And you may recall that in the New Testament, when Jesus is talking on the Sermon on the Mount, one of the things that he said is that truly, truly, I say to you, not one smallest letter or stroke will pass away from the law until all is fulfilled. When he said that, he did not mean that when scribes copied the biblical text that they would never forget a letter or that they would never make any mistakes. What he meant was that when God says he will do something, it remains unchanged. You can't modify it. And in Hebrew, every letter is essential to preserving the meaning of a particular word. So if you drop out even the smallest letter, it could change the meaning of what God said. If you added a little extension to a stroke, it would change it from, for example, a bait to a cough, and a B and a K could make all the difference in the world in terms of meaning. So he meant God's word doesn't change. And as you look at these examples, what you'll see is that the smallest strokes can make a difference in terms of the differentiation between these consonants. In the first cluster, you see bait, cough, and pay. And you'll notice that the cough, with its curved shape, is very similar to both letters on either side. The bait has a flat baseline, though. It has a little projection that sticks out to the right. The pay has a projection that protrudes into the center. These distinctions are important to differentiate these letters. You'll notice Vav, Zion, Yod, and final Nun. In these letters, again, it's the height of the letters, whether or not they extend below the line. The head on a Vav versus a Zion that indicates which letter is in view. Dalet, Resh, and final Kaf. You'll notice that the difference between Dalet and Resh is simply whether or not it has a squared corner. The Dalet has the square shape to it. It projects off on the right, whereas the Resh is rounded. The final Kaf, as we noted before, is differentiated by whether or not it extends below the line. Ayin and Sade. These two letters are differentiated by the angles with which the strokes are made. And that is the only distinction that's going to help you differentiate them. Tet and Mem, probably less similar. You won't make this mistake as often, but beginning students often find them confusing, mostly because of how curved and shaped and where the openings are and how rounded the letters are. He, Chet, and Tav, again, are differentiated by very small differences in strokes. The He is open. The Chet is closed, differentiating the two H consonants, hard and soft. The Tav has a little foot on the bottom left that differentiates it from the Chet. Samik and Mem. These two consonants are also very commonly confused when you're first learning the Hebrew alphabet. The Samic is rounded, the Mem is squared off, and the Mem will only appear at the end of a word because this is a final form. And then lastly, the Gimel and the Nun, where the projection at the bottom of the Gimel is going to be important in making that distinction. That leaves us with two sets of characters that we need to address as a special grouping. The first group of characters is what we refer to as the Begad Kafat letters. 6 letters that indicate a special pronunciation in sound when they have a dot in those letters. The mnemonic Begad Kafat reflects Beit, Gimel, Dalet, B, G, D, Begad, and Kafat, Kaf, Pe, Tav, K, F, T, Begad Kafat. Those 6 letters appear in the biblical text both with a dot and without a dot, and it indicates a difference in pronunciation historically. In modern pronunciation, 3 of these historical distinctions are no longer utilized. It's pronounced the same whether it has a dot or not. But in 3 cases, in the Beit, the Kaf, and the Pe, you will still hear a difference in sound depending on whether it has a dot or not. Think of the dot as your fist and think of it as force, as air, as power. These letters, when they have a dot, indicate a hard, explosive pronunciation. When they do not have a dot, they reflect airflow, softness. It's the transition from a vowel into the consonant that softens its sound. So the letter Beit, when it has a dot in it, a Begad Kafat dot, when it has this dot, is going to be pronounced hard as in the word boy. I start with my lips closed, boy, and it explodes. That hard sound is the sound that you hear in a Beit with the dot. When it does not have a dot, you're going to hear more of a V sound. Think of av, with air moving into a B after the sound ah, av. That V sound is going to be how you're going to pronounce a Beit when it does not have a dot. With the letter Kaf, the same will be true. When it has a dot, you'll pronounce it hard, as in the word kick, explosive. When it does not have a dot, you'll hear a sound more like you would find in the word Loch Ness. So the distinction is going to be a Kaf with a dot will sound like k, but without a dot, more like k, k, k. Those two sounds are going to be what you'll hear with Kaf. And then lastly, with Pe, you'll see a distinction in sound that's probably actually more familiar to you because we often put the letter P together with H. Air. When we put P and H together, we get the F sound as in philosophy. So when you see the letter Pe with a dot, it will sound like P as in pet. But when you see a Pe without a dot, it will sound more like an F sound as in philosophy. The Gimel, Dalet, and Tav originally had pronunciations that were differentiated as well, but those are no longer pronounced, and so we follow the modern conventions in terms of the way that we pronounce those. The last set of letters that you should be aware of are the gutturals. The guttural letters are letters that are pronounced in the back of the throat. The aleph and ayin, the chet and he, and also the guttural resh, like you hear in French, are pronounced in the back of the throat. Because they are pronounced in the back of the throat, these consonants have particular features that will become quite prominent for you as we move along in the grammar. 2 features that are characteristic of these gutturals is that they prefer to have an A-class vowel, the ah sound. If you say the vowels, ah, eh, I, O, U. The ah is the one that is pronounced in the back of the throat, where the gutturals are pronounced. So it's kind of intuitive that these letters would prefer to be pronounced with that vowel because it makes a much easier transition in sound. It's not some special rule that you need to learn. It's just simply a phenomenon of pronunciation. They are also letters that are very difficult to double. So if we take the word little in English, you hear the two syllables little, little, and you double the T. The gutturals are very difficult to double. How do you double or it's impossible to double those letters. As a result, these guttural letters, as we move on in the grammar, are going to be the ones that you're going to see as preferring A-class vowels and not doubling. So, in review, you have seen the transition between Paleo-Hebrew and the square script that is used today. That transition helps us understand the relationship between the names of the letters, which no longer match their shape, and the sounds. The name of the letter is its original shape in Paleo-Hebrew. The first sound in that name indicates the pronunciation of the letters. You've seen the shape of these letters, and you've seen their sequence. You should memorize those. And we've also learned two sets of special characters that will become important in future discussions. The Begad Kafat letters that can appear with a dot or without a dot. And we're going to remember that as a Begad Kafat dot. And the guttural letters that prefer A-class vowels and do not double.